let me first hear the other speaker of today's panel, Mr. Parag Vyas, who I'm sure with his rich experience of having worked as an investor, as a practitioner in the field of energy, not only in India, but outside India in other countries. With his experience, how does he see this role of hydrogen playing out vis-a-vis other forms of energy systems and energy transition, and what role this can play in Ladakh? Mr. Vyas, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi, for your invitation to this panel. And can I just say it's a pleasure to hear the discussions from my fellow and distinguished panel members. That's been very interesting for me. I'll just give a brief introduction to myself and where I'm coming from, and then I thought I'd share my thoughts with you on the techno-economic considerations for hydrogen in remote regions like Ladakh, and also with a focus on transport, because we've been discussing that. And what I hope I can get across is a discussion of the why, the what, and the how of hydrogen, I think, looking at transport in Ladakh. Okay, but just a little bit about me. So, and I think you introduced me at the beginning, but I'm an executive with over 25 years of experience with corporations like Rolls-Royce, like General Electric, and like Aggreko. I'm also a council member of a body called the Regulatory Horizons Council. And this is an independent expert body that advises the UK government, Department of Business and Energy, on regulatory reforms. And we've looked at things like fusion energy and drones, and we will be looking at hydrogen very shortly. Hydrogen is gaining huge significance in the UK and across Europe. And so the regulatory reforms needed for the safe and rapid adoption of hydrogen technologies is something that's of concern to everyone, okay, both in the UK and internationally. But let me move on now to the real discussion here, the why, the what, and the how. And let's start with the why. Why hydrogen in transport, and why remote regions like Ladakh? Okay, so let's start with the why hydrogen in transport. The thing is, whenever we want to look at zero carbon transport, the first thing that comes to mind, it's battery electric vehicles. And it's probably true to say this is the simplest and most cost-effective technology that we have today. And you only need to look around the world. You need to look at the likes of Tesla, or the big automotive OEMs, the likes of Renault or Volkswagen, and they are having a lot of success commercializing battery electric vehicles, whereas hydrogen electric vehicles are somewhat less mature technically and more expensive. But I think what we need to focus on is maybe less away from passenger vehicles and towards what we would probably consider heavy duty vehicles, because batteries have a very low energy density. They're very heavy, not only they're expensive, but they're very heavy. So anytime we want to travel a long distance or carry an appreciable amount of freight or an appreciable number of passengers, the mass of the batteries becomes a burden. Basically, the heavier the battery, the less freight you can carry. So for heavy duty vehicles of all types, a fuel, an energy dense fuel like hydrogen becomes competitive and attractive. Okay, not just on a cost basis, but a cost per kilometer or a cost per ton of freight transported basis. And this applies to all forms of transport. So whether it's off-road, agricultural vehicles, industrial vehicles, whether it's on-road trucks and heavy duty, heavy goods vehicles, or whether it's in fact trains. So remote parts of Europe, like Scotland, where the lines are very expensive to electrify, hydrogen trains are under consideration, and even boats. So I know Ladakh may be less relevant, but for a maritime nation like the UK, displacing diesel from boats is definitely, or fossil fuels from boats, definitely on the agenda. So we have why transport, hydrogen transport, why remote regions? And I think this comes down to cost. Cost competitiveness is going to drive hydrogen. Cost competitiveness against diesel, the fossil fuels, and cost competitiveness against the cost of upgrading the electrical infrastructure. Okay, so these are the two factors that will drive the economics. And I think, so coming back to costs of diesel and fossil fuels, we heard very eloquently from Mr. Panda the logistical issues involved with transporting diesel fuel to remote regions. And that transport and logistic cost is actually quite a high fraction of the delivered price of diesel. So it already means that if we're in any hydrogen application where we're wanting to displace a diesel fuel or a fossil fuel, because diesel or fossil fuel costs are more expensive in remote regions, it's going to be more competitive there from the get-go, okay? So payback will always be quicker if the diesel price is higher, wherever you go in the world. The second factor is, if we want to achieve and get to net zero and a zero carbon economy, we start with the electrical infrastructure we have today, okay, which is supplying existing demands, existing electrical loads. But net zero implies decarbonizing both transport and heating and cooking. So if we look in, for example, the UK or across Europe, heating is traditionally supplied through natural gas. So for the UK, coming from the North Sea, and for homes more in remoter regions, off the natural gas grid, then liquid petroleum gas is the fuel. Displacing fossil fuel by electricity, especially for climates, northern European climates, displacing heating implies maybe a doubling of electrical power capacity going into the homes. Because we consume, maybe a country like, or a region like Scotland, maybe 50% of the energy consumption and 50% of the carbon emissions are due to domestic and commercial space heating. It's a phenomenal amount of energy and actually can't just be supplied with the existing electrical grid. So the real question is, what is the cost of doubling the electrical capacity? That's transmission, distribution, transformers, substations, and all the way down to domestic and commercial buildings. That's a huge infrastructure upgrade. So the question there is then, can hydrogen be a more cost-effective energy vector to produce the heating and cooking that we need? And one thing that Panitech is doing is we're actually pursuing a project in a rural community in Scotland, and this we think is one of the first of the kind across the whole of Europe. It'll be a net zero hydrogen powered community where we will supply the electrical load, but also the heating and transport needs for a farm and a domestic rural community. So that means supplying hydrogen for hydrogen domestic vehicles, hydrogen agro-industrial vehicles, tractors, loading machines and so on, hydrogen for use with hydrogen gas boilers to provide hot water and heating, and also cooking. And then electricity is coming from local renewable electricals, wind turbines and solar. Okay, so that's the kind of pioneering project I think we need, and looks replicable across the world if we take the different modules and building blocks there. Okay, so we discussed why. How about what do we need to deliver that hydrogen? And the obvious answer is we need two things first. What do we need to produce the hydrogen, and what do we need to use that hydrogen? And the obvious answer for the what is what do we need to produce the hydrogen? The obvious answer is an electrolyzer. So a wind or solar powered hydrogen electrolyzer will produce green hydrogen. Okay, and the technology has been around for more than 100 years, namely alkaline electrolyzer. So very well established technology. The costs and efficiencies are well understood. But we see also right now a lot of innovation happening. Okay, firstly with the growth or development of PEM electrolyzers. And part of the proposition with PEM electrolyzers is their ability to load follow. So if you have variable output renewable generation, PEM electrolyzers are very well suited to follow that load and produce hydrogen. What Panitech we are doing is we're working with a Canadian company, an electrolyzer company, and they've developed a novel cell architecture using alkaline electrolyzers, and they are combining both the longevity and cost advantages of alkaline with the load following advantages of PEM. And this is something that we hope we will be able to trial then soon in Scotland. And we have a product technology roadmap that means that it becomes very competitive in terms of cost, efficiency, and stack life within a period of 5 years. Okay, so we know that the electrolyzer space is technology space, definitely very innovative, a lot of R&D investment going in, and the technology is coming along very fast. And for me, in my experience, it really resembles the early days of solar and wind, where the initial costs were very high, but a lot of companies started to innovate and develop, and we saw really rapid drops in price, increases in reliability, and improvements in efficiency 20 years ago, say, in Europe. Okay, so the what, how do we produce, and the what, how do we, what do we do to use that, especially in vehicles? And I think part of the discussion is hydrogen vehicles is actually very interesting. There are at least 3 different options to get there, and I really think it's interesting to look at a stepping stone or intermediate option to hydrogen vehicles, and that is retrofit diesel hydrogen dual fuel vehicles. And the reason I say that is what's interesting. First of all, it's technically feasible and easily and relatively straightforward and cost effective to add hydrogen injection equipment onto an existing diesel vehicle. So the good news is if you have that vehicle, you don't need to scrap it to go to hydrogen. What you can do is blend hydrogen in to the engine and maybe displace up to about 20% of the diesel that's used on a journey. So this gives you an advantage. If you already have hydrogen, you can start to use your existing fleet of vehicles. They don't become stranded assets, and you can get an immediate diesel saving impact. And you can spread that across a large number of, a large fleet of vehicles. And if you actually run out of hydrogen, it's not an issue. You can go back to 100% diesel as a backup. So this is something that we see already in Europe. I know, for example, so close to where I live in Glasgow, they're having hydrogen dual fuel municipal trucks, where the hydrogen is coming from a large wind farm outside Glasgow, which has something like 20 to 30% curtailment. So the electricity is supplied at zero marginal cost. We're seeing hydrogen boats in the Netherlands and in Belgium, hydrogen retrofit dual fuel agricultural vehicles in North America, for example, in Canada as well. Diesel hydrogen retrofit trucks with hydrogen as a service. So this is an established technology and perhaps something to consider as a stepping stone to the full hydrogen economy in a cost-effective and low-risk way. Okay. Beyond that, there are 2 other routes to hydrogen vehicles. One is taking the internal combustion engine but going to 100% hydrogen. And this is already well-established technology. I do remember working back in Germany, maybe 20 years ago, 10 years ago now. BMW, they ran a fleet of 7 Series cars 100% hydrogen, onboard hydrogen storage. They had hydrogen fueling stations. The technology exists, but perhaps it didn't get so much traction, so to speak, because the most efficient solution would be hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. So hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle is basically an electric vehicle where the electricity is supplied by a hydrogen fuel cell. And it's fair to say we see a lot of trials of things like hydrogen buses in Europe, but it's fair to say the commercialization is not there yet because, one, the technology is still not fully mature. The trials we see are R&D or pilot demonstrators, are not commercial trials. And secondly, the capex costs of these buses, it is very high. So they are only viable if they receive a high subsidy or R&D grant to make it affordable. So the outlook for that, I think, definitely there's a lot of work to be done, and it's a solution, but it's perhaps something for the long term, whereas dual fuel retrofit is something that can be done and deployed today. So we've talked about the why, the what. Now let's just a little bit discuss the how. What's the route to getting to a hydrogen economy? And I think there are two things we need to do there, stepping stones. One, we do actually need to create the market. Okay, and then secondly, pilot demonstrators are definitely going to be important, both technically and for investment. So what do I mean by creating the market? And we have examples of this across Europe. In the early days, 20 years ago, for example, there was very much the start of the trend towards clean tech and the green economy. And government incentives were needed to kickstart and develop the technology and to get companies to invest in R&D. And we saw a very successful example of that when the German government, I think this is a really good example, about 20 years ago, introduced a feed-in tariff for solar. Back then, it was something like of the order of 50 euro cents per kilowatt hour you would get if you had a solar panel feeding into the grid. And we know since then how the business invested, scaled up, and the costs came rapidly, fell rapidly. Solar eventually hit grid parity, and now I think in India, solar costs are below 3 US cents per kilowatt hour easily. Okay, so solar has become really effective, but it was introduced and scaled up by businesses invested in because of the initial feed-in tariff. And we've seen something similar in the United Kingdom with offshore wind. So again, initially, a very expensive renewable energy technology. So the cost of installing wind turbines offshore is logistically, it's very difficult. The turbines have to be bigger, they have to withstand corrosion and higher forces. But what we've seen through a mechanism called contracts for difference, which is again another kind of incentive scheme that's structured around forward contracts or futures contracts, we've seen costs for UK offshore wind fall to below 5 pence per kilowatt hour, being competitive with the wholesale price of electricity. Okay, so it's really, I'm making the point that it's these incentives that attract companies to invest in the technologies and project developers that to develop and learn and gain experience in developing the projects to scale up, which gets the cost down. And there's a chicken and egg situation there. So this is something to really consider in the context of India and doing business in India. The last incentive measure is essentially the other way around. It's actually carbon taxes. So carbon taxes will penalize fossil fuel or CO2 emissions. And we know today something like a carbon tax, an EU carbon tax through the EU emissions trading scheme of around 30 to 50 euros a ton. We think that will make hydrogen competitive. and subsidy-free, essentially, by 2030, just purely due to the fact of the deflationary historic trends of renewable energy and the development of electrolyzer technology going forward. So at 30 euros per ton carbon tax, this is certainly something that will make hydrogen viable within 10 years, okay? So certainly creating the market, it needs some consideration of the incentives. The other part is de-risking the technology. De-risking the technology allows for both the technology to develop, but also for investors to have certainty what can be delivered, what can be worked, and to be able to finance future projects. And we're very keen in Planetech of doing pilot demonstrators. I think this will be something very important for India. I'll give you the example, the fuel cell bus programs around Europe are really uncovering technical challenges and difficulties, but helping to improve the technology for fuel cell buses. We need something like that as well in India, in Ladakh. And this will be important in bringing together and trialing the business cases, the supply chain, the installers, the contractors, the technologies, because for sure there will be environmental conditions, ambient conditions, and use cases that we don't know about because this technology is so new. Okay, so just to conclude, we see hydrogen is incredibly important politically all across Europe and North America, in the regions and nations, and even at the European Union, and we now see in India exactly the same. And I think the driving and influence factors are very similar across the globe. The need to decarbonize, the difficulty of decarbonizing transport and heating, the costs involved of fossil fuels and upgrading the electrical infrastructure, and the opportunity that comes through new technology and R&D and technology investment. And I think there is definitely a really good opportunity in Ladakh for hydrogen, based on the costs of the logistical cost of transporting and delivering fossil fuels, and also the challenges of upgrading electrical infrastructure. And so supplying electricity locally with embedded generation through solar and wind, for example, and local hydrogen can be cost effective and a shortcut in terms of time to getting to low carbon hydrogen, low carbon economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vyas. Thanks a lot. You have made an excellent presentation on all the aspects of how hydrogen can be used as the lever for decarbonization and also to meet the energy future, energy needs. And you've explained it very well. You of course underscored the fact that it's important to create a market. It's important to create a right framework of incentives to be able to move in that direction. And some of the existing costs are a good, compelling reason for us to already start investing in that area. Mr. Panda did talk about, the huge logistic cost of moving petrol or diesel from the refineries to Ladakh. And that itself, I don't know whether the delivered cost of diesel and petrol in Ladakh, we are building that cost into the final price or not. But certainly there is an economic reason. There is a case for building this cost into the final delivered price, so that the solutions that you're all pointing out become viable, economically viable, and implementable. When ultimately all the policies have to be tested on the fulcrum of their implementability, their economic viability. Ultimately, somebody has to pay for it. So it's important to create the right market conditions and to let them build up the synergy through a host of market-based initiatives as well as government regulatory interventions. So thank you very much for giving us this range of choices.